Okay, good. Good. Okay, Mr. Esan, welcome to the program. We've just got to get started because we have a lot to chew today. Let me start with the question that um, are fuel subsidies really bad for the Nigerian economy? Let me start there. Since fuel subsidies have been in existence in Nigeria in the 1970s, I think precisely 1977, there was a decree, I think, by the former president then, not President Buhari, not Obasanjo. He was a military leader at that time in 1977 and introduced the subsidies. But are fuel subsidies bad for the Nigerian economy?
Okay, so thanks again, Nancy, for having me. Subsidy in itself is not a bad concept. Every serious country around the world have one form of subsidy or another. And indirectly, they do subsidize cost of transportation, using their public transportation system. So it was not designed to be a bad thing. But I think where we are now as a nation is we are dealing with a catch-22 situation right now where, over time, the subsidy cost has ballooned, and yet we've not been able to fix our public, transportation system. And that is, when you now couple that with the, ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia, it has exacerbated the situation. That is why, World Bank is concerned, just like any other, serious economists around the world, that what does this mean for developing countries, and specifically, what does this mean for Nigeria?
The
So
question.
if you ask me, is subsidy really bad? No, subsidy is not bad because it's always a way to protect the poor in any economy. So as a concept, it's not a bad idea, but I think it's how it has turned out in Nigeria over the years.
Okay, Olumide, my question actually is fuel subsidy bad for the Nigerian economy, not subsidy? Because I do know that even other economies, even in the United States, there are Greek subsidies and what have you. But in this case now, we're discussing fuel subsidies. Are they regressive for the Nigerian economy since we've been implementing these fuel subsidies? And let me also go back to history. The history of this fuel subsidy is that to minimize the impact of higher global oil prices on Nigerians. And we're still in the same situation now, which we were in the 70s, which was why it was introduced. But is fuel subsidy bad for the country right now? How regressive is it?
Okay, so for the country right now, yes, the subsidy is hurting us as a country. Subsidy is taking away funds that should have been invested in public infrastructures, in education, in health services, is taking them away. So right now, the subsidy is hurting us. It's hurting us. And again, I go back to what I said earlier. Um, we must not look at fuel subsidy as possible. We must look at it as a form of energy subsidy, which again I say that you find around the world most times. If you look at the public transportation system in Europe, for example, the train, the rail, the underground systems are subsidized in the Western world. So if you look at it in the context of a country that doesn't really have much of railways, an underground system and tube systems, then what we have is, mass transit of all manner of kinds. And that is, if you would argue that that is what the intention of government actually should be, to subsidize, the masses via the public transportation system. So, but if you look at where we are today, of course, with projected 5.5 trillion by the World Bank and 4 trillion that we also had in the revised budget, it is hurting us. It's hurting our economy as a nation. So to that extent, yes, it is bad.
Okay. Do you think that the Nigerian government understand how bad fuel subsidies are for the economy? That's the A part of the question. The B part of the question is, do you think that Nigerians understand how retrogressive this fuel subsidy has been for the country?
Yes, to the A question, Nigerian government fully understands that this subsidy regime is hurting our economy. But I did say earlier that we're in a catch-22 situation. Inflation right now for May was 17.7. If you decouple and look at food as a subset and a significant part of the inflation basket, it was already 19.9 or thereabouts in May. If you remove subsidy, you're going to see, something that is close to runaway inflation in the country. And that could lead to insecurity because it could lead to unrest. So regardless of how it is right now, the government cannot just remove subsidy, from Nigeria. Now, let me break this down, Nancy. Right now, on the average, in June or May, it was about $120 a barrel of crude oil as was being sold in the international market. If you use an exchange rate, which is real, of 600 and not the official rate of 413 or thereabout, that translates to 72,000 naira per barrel. 72,000 naira per barrel. Now there are 160 liters in each barrel. If you divide that to 160 liters by 72,000, it comes to 450 naira. It means that the crude oil content of every liter of PMS is about 450 naira. Refining cost, including additives, is in the range of 0.4 to 0.7 cents per gallon, and there are 4 liters in a gallon. Now that translates to additional maybe like 100 naira refining cost. That builds up the cost to 550. And then we're not talking about transportation and marketing. If you have those two, then you're looking at 700 and 750 in terms of the cost of PMS, and we're paying like 165. That leaves a subsidy of at least 500 or 600, depending on parameters. That is simply not sustainable. We consume about 1.5 billion liters a day. That translates to 900. That translates to about 900 billion a month in subsidy. I mean, there's no way that any economy can sustain that. Even if you assume that the subsidy is 500 naira and not 600 naira, that translates to almost like 750 billion a month, which is like 9 trillion a year. So I can understand where World Bank is coming from when they are saying 5.5 trillion, because if you use official rates instead of 600 that I've used, you probably will come to around 6 trillion in terms of subsidy. So it's huge, it's humongous. But I think the challenge with government as well is, look, you don't want to you don't want inflation to escalate further, and that is why it is important that they have some, I would say, structured way of dealing with this issue of fuel subsidy. I mean, in most other jurisdictions, general subsidy, Nancy, is granted and is means tested. In other words, there is a mechanism in place to assess the financial capacity of households before subsidies or support from government are given to them. So I think one of the challenges we have is we do not have that sophistication in terms of data to be able to gather who earns what and who should be subsidized. In my view, a very simple thing we could have done is to design a way where only public transportation vehicles are subsidized, and then the rest of the public buy or pay for the full price of refined product, just the way as people are paying for diesel. If we are able to do that, it's only these buses, that carrying, individuals around as means of public transportation are receiving subsidy. Maybe we will be able to cut down the cost of subsidy by 70%. But you and I know there is no current data to help with that, but I think it's something that can be done in the short term by government to spend money to get data, fix it. You could even designate, NNPC filling stations as the filling stations where public transportation vehicles can, stop to refuel, and they can buy at subsidized prices. So that way, you cut down 70% on subsidy, and that would count for something. In the long term, ultimately, you must develop the transportation system and let the subsidy go into the public transportation system as it is done elsewhere in the world.
So what you've just said now, it's like a compensation or compensation measures by which government can use. But I want us to go back again to the basics, because we're talking about fuel subsidy, talking about fuel subsidy. At the launch of the Nigeria Development Update just a few days ago by the World Bank, of course, Marco Hernandez, who is the lead economist for Nigeria that presented the report, did speak elaborately on fuel subsidy. And he did say that, and the three things he said caught my attention, which is in the report, that when it comes to this fuel subsidy, that many Nigerians, number one, do not know how fuel subsidies work. Number two, even after the information is given to them, they do not support the removal. Then number three, they do not even trust government to use the proceeds. But Olumide, we will continue this. Let's continue to, I will continue to speak with you because I'm being told now we're going for a live broadcast in Port Harcourt, but still hang on with me. Local or terrestrial viewers will still get to watch this program. So we're going right away to Port Harcourt, the River State capital. All right, Olumide, like I was speaking earlier on, Nigerians do not know how the fuel subsidy work. Even after the information is given to them, they do not support its removal. Then number three, they do not even trust the government to use the proceeds that we're saying, okay, it's going to cost government 4 trillion, costs government 5 trillion or 6 trillion. They do not even believe that the government would use those funds judiciously. So let's start from that. How does this fuel subsidy mechanism work? How does it work in the first place for Nigerians to understand?
Okay, so thanks, Nancy. Before, recent times, it was a rather complex process of importers bringing the products and, they get paid subsidy. Then we had all manner of issues around whether they actually brought in products or it was just paper they signed, and whether or not the right amount was being paid. But all those have been resolved now because it's NNPC that basically brings in this refined product now through a process that they call, DSDP, direct sales and direct purchase. So NNPC would, buy these refined products from, renowned marketers around the world, and then in return, we'll pay with crude swap. In other words, they give crude oil to the counterparties. Now that has simplified, and removed the complexity of the past around each importer, coming in and, claiming this is what I've imported and this is what I need to be paid for. Now, so NNPC basically is importer of records now, brings these, refined products into Nigeria. And then, so all you need to compensate the marketers and retailers are, the retailers' margin and also the transportation cost. So, so it's a lot more simplified, but you may even still have issues around, how much do you get, as margin, or how much is transportation cost, how much is bridging cost. But those are less of an issue than what we used to have in the past. But, Nigerians do, some Nigerians do understand this, really, quite frankly, not that they don't. But I think there's general consensus that Nigeria is still, in the words of former Prime Minister of the UK, many Nigerians think the country is still fantastically corrupt. And to that extent, they say to themselves that, look, this is all I can get, because at the end of the day, if these monies were saved, if subsidy were removed, the money will be stolen from the treasury. So there is trust deficit issue between, the government and the people in the past. And, recent scandals have also not helped to bridge that gap. So until Nigerians come to have that faith and trust in their government, they will continue to think that any money saved from public goods would ultimately be stolen by a few people. And so that is, for me, the biggest, challenge that Nigerians have. They can't just get to that point where they can trust their government again. And I think government needs to work on that to bridge that trust deficit over time. When you're able to bridge that trust deficit over time, you can then, talk about removing subsidy, and then people will have faith that whatever you save from subsidy will go into healthcare or will go into education. Look, ASU has been on strike for a while. If we were all convinced that if we save money from first subsidy, it will go into our institutions or in the education sector in general or in the health sector in general, I think it provides a more compelling case and argument for government to say, look, we need to phase out the issue of subsidy.
Now, still talking about those three parameters, what the study brought out, the report, the second part of it is that even after the information is given, the Nigerians do not support subsidy removal. Do you think that the concept of the national cake applies to this? Because I'm also trying to benchmark it historically, what happened in the 70s, whereby the government really at that point just unleashed subsidies, both fuel, electricity, even Nigeria Airways at that time. Either you will fly with no ticket, or they will reduce your ticket. They were subsidized, and see how everything panned out. Electricity at that time, NEPA, that time we just give, they were not even, nobody was paying for light, nothing, and everything crumbled. So do you think that the concept of that national cake is still applying here, where Nigerians don't even want to support the removal because they see that this is the only thing we can gain from government too? If we tell them to remove it, there's nothing we are gaining.
No, Nancy, you're spot on. It's a mindset that Nigerians have. Recently I had conversation with some, middle class folks and upwardly mobile individuals, and they also, objected to subsidy removal. But exactly what they said, look, this is our own national cake. This is all we can get from the government. I mean, recently the CBN even, was lamenting that a lot of people that they supported in different agri programs are not repaying those loans. And it's the same mindset that this is, national cake. This, I must get my share. So nobody can deny that. It's a mindset that all Nigerians across strata have, that look, if it's national, I must mind my share of it. So, and again, I will link it that this had to do, I'm not sure it's essentially about entitlement mindset. I think it's more about the trust deficit, because when you ask them why do they think that way, most people will say, look, after all, if it doesn't come to me, it will be stolen. That is what an average Nigerian will say. It doesn't have to me. Some people will misappropriate it. So why not let me just get my own? Why they do whatever they like with the rest. So you can't detach the two. That trust deficit is a major factor why Nigerians think about the concept of national cake at all times.
Okay.
Nancy.
Um, the third part of it, which you spoke about earlier, in terms of Nigerians don't really trust the government to use the proceeds to use the proceeds judiciously. How do you think that the government can really reassure Nigerians or earn the trust of Nigerians? I think that should be the language. How should the government earn the trust of Nigerians? What steps can be taken now to earn the trust of Nigerians so that it will be easier for the government to take off this thing if indeed is really hurtful?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. I mean, it's a very difficult one for Nigerian government. A trust that has been destroyed for decades. You're not going to fix it overnight, but you can start to do little things. And people have always said that one way is transparency. Actually, government needs to demonstrate most transparency in the way resources are allocated and utilized. That is one thing they can do to the micro level of departments within the ministry. So it, unless you get to that granular level to demonstrate transparency in how resources are used, you will continue to work with the baggage of the past, because each time people look at you, they just think of the fact that, look, this government is all for itself, and then people, they are just misappropriating funds. There's no way you'll be able to wash yourself clean. And in as much as you can't do that, the trust issue will remain. So I think there are little things government can start to do from the point of view of transparency. There is no magic. It will take time, but I think government can get there, in fixing the trust issues. I mean, if you, of course, over the years, we've seen some improvement in transparency. I mean, and with, NGOs like Budget and the rest of them out there, they help us to see more. You can query more, you can interact more with the numbers. But, there's a lot more that still needs to be done in terms of, perception. I know to a lot of people now, see perception is reality. If people perceive that the government is corrupt, it really doesn't matter what the government is doing about it. They will always see it as a corrupt government. But what I'm saying is, let that be a step change. Start from the little things. Be more accountable to the Nigerian citizens. When you say you're spending, the other day, I think it was within the last 2 weeks, the Ghanaian minister, I think either finance minister or so, was brought on TV by opposition party, and he was grilled of how he had spent, money, subsidy type of money during this pandemic period. And step by step, he gave details and gave documentation to support how government had spent money in this COVID era. That level of granularity is what Nigerians also want to see in their government before we can start to fix this, trust deficit gap that exists currently.
Now, fuel subsidy is a very sticky issue in Nigeria, and we're looking at even the general elections that will come up in 2023. I guess that many of the presidential candidates now should be looking at that. Some are already looking at it. I've seen some like removal of subsidy in a plan, an economic plan of a candidate. But the question is, even how would you do that? My question now to you is that how do you think that the balancing between or amongst the political, social, and economic angles really should be looked at? I know you've been talking about it, but it's really more of a political issue now than more of an economic issue in Nigeria, because this government, when it was not in government, many actors in this government were against President Jonathan in 2012 when he removed the subsidy. Many of them did protest on the streets of Lagos, and they are in power now, and they can't remove it, because they said, oh, President Jonathan, you can't remove it, or this. They came in now and saw the same thing, that, we need to remove this thing, but they cannot remove it. So how should the balancing between the political and social, and perhaps the social economic angle should be brought into it?
Yes, indeed, Nancy, it's a tough one. Nobody can guarantee that, he would or she would be able to remove subsidy day one if elected into office. We're talking about a country where minimum wage is 30,000, and which a lot of companies and governments, sub-governments, are still struggling to pay the minimum wage. You take away subsidy, and then pump price of fuel becomes, between 700 naira and 800 naira. How would they survive? What effect would that have on inflation? Food inflation would probably go to 40%. Overall inflation will probably go to 30%. I mean, how exactly is the country going to survive? I mean, that's a big question. That is why, any solution must be well thought out. I am also mindful that, with debt service hanging of, maybe, 5 trillion or 6 trillion, depending on how we settle in 2022, coupled with subsidy of almost 6 trillion, that is 12 trillion, without talking about recurrent expenditure, capital expenditure. And we already, most times, maybe we settle for a revenue of 7 trillion. I mean, so that means between first subsidy and debt service, we already have a deficit of 5 trillion, without even talking about recurrent expenditure with salaries, statutory transfers and capital expenditure. So clearly, we're at a fiscal cliff. We have an issue, real big one. But having said that, how do we fix it? Taking subsidy away immediately would land us in even a deeper crisis, because, upon this economic crisis, you don't want to have civil unrest. A lot more people will push into the poverty line, and then you have insecurity issues all around the country, more armed robbery incidents, more brazen robbery incidents during daytime. So, the candidates need to tell us precisely how they're going to work this out, step by step. What do they even know? What is the number? You want to remove 600 naira subsidy per liter. Okay, how exactly do you want to do that? What other measures do you want to put in place, to help the citizens as you are taking this off? Just to be clear, Nancy, I am pro removal of subsidy, because I think it's hurting our economy. And for as long as you have subsidy in place, you can't stop smuggling. I was discussing with a friend over the weekend, and he told me that, recently I went to Togo. The moment I crossed Nigerian border, PMS was being sold for an equivalent of 700 naira per liter. That tells you what happens all around us. Being sold for 700 naira per liter. and being sold for 165 naira per liter. It's economics. People will smuggle out. They will smuggle to Togo, they will smuggle to Chad, to Niger, to Cameroon. They will do it. So certainly, subsidy needs to go. Perhaps that would maybe about 30% of what we even say subsidy is going to some other countries, or people are smuggling it out. But the reality is, I want to see what exactly would this intending government do? I mean, these candidates, they spell it out. How are you going to cushion the effect? Because that is what is most important. If we were in a country where we have data, we can do means-tested transfers. Okay, households that are earning less than 400,000 naira a year. Okay, government will be transferring 50,000 in fuel subsidy to you or something like that. We don't even have those kind of data. So it's not good enough for people to say candidates to say we will remove subsidy. How are you going to manage the process without pushing this country to the brink of civil unrest?
You've raised fundamental questions, and thank you also for clarifying that, because when you were talking, I was also trying to place where you are. Are you anti-removal or are you pro-removal? So it was good that you clarified that. With what we're seeing right now, I spoke to the president of IPMAN, Independent Petroleum Marketers Association of Nigeria, last Thursday, and he did tell me that we're paying 165 now, and I did put it to him that is in Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt or so that will pay 165. In other parts of the country, in Enugu, in Kano, in Katsina, and other places, they pay far above 165. And he did push it back to me and said, Nancy, it's because of the subsidy. That's why the prices are even like that. That if not of the subsidy, we would be paying close to 700 or 800 naira a liter for fuel. Do you agree with him?
If there isn't subsidy, like I tried to do the math at the beginning, you will have a cost of between $700 and $800. 800 naira per liter. We were supposed to have gotten here with the PIA signed, okay, because Section 205 of that act specifically guaranteed unrestricted market pricing. What would have then happened is marketers will compete fair and square. So if you are an inefficient marketer, your margin will not compete with those of efficient marketers, and so you would have companies have marketing the petrol stations all around the country, and they will sell at near uniform price to what they sell different parts of the country, what they sell in Lagos, what they're selling in Kano, in Bauchi, to the extent that the margins are still decent. The petroleum regulatory authorities, particularly the midstream, Nigerian midstream and downstream petroleum regulatory authority, can intervene in some instances to ensure there's uniform pricing around the country, to the extent that largely these are still commercially determined prices, just to ensure that people buying petrol in Abuja are not paying unnecessarily higher than people buying in Lagos. But like I said, if you left it to the forces of supply and demand and market forces, we should be paying between 700 and 800, and that's the math I did at the beginning. So the subsidy thing creates so many shocks across the value chain, and that is why in a bid to solve one problem, we keep creating another. Okay, you want to solve the bridging issue, you create another problem along the chain. So ultimately, the solution is to remove subsidy. I think the challenge which a lot of people, including myself, have got is how exactly do you do that without, in a bid to solve economic problem, you do not create political problems, and because I think things like civil unrest and the rest of them are political problems. So while trying to solve one problem, let's not create another. And that is why I don't agree with shortarism, the approach that let's just remove it one time like that. If we do that, it's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for disaster because people will riot, and we don't want to get to that point as a nation.
Since the government has really kicked the can down the road now, this government has no appetite, definitely, for fuel subsidy removal now. What do you think will be really the corrosive effects on oil investments in the country? Because the PIA was signed last year, 2021, and people like you were very excited. Many people were excited that, oh, this will really bring the much needed investment. This would unlock a lot of potentials in the industry, even for the gas industry as well. But with the can kicked down the road, what do you think will be the corrosive effects on investments?
Okay, so Nancy, the kicking the can down the road obviously would have an impact, and mostly in the area of confidence and trust on the part of the investors in government. So if you've promised, you've signed a law that guaranteed unrestricted market pricing, and almost a year after you're still running subsidy. I know that they were going to send I don't know if they've done that now, send an amendment to National Assembly on that just to address that specifically. But the reality is that it gives investors the signal that you're not committed to your words. So that's it's not good for confidence building, quite frankly. But having said that, I think there are other issues that would, make that even pale into insignificance. So the issue of, subsidy is an issue on PIA. It borders on confidence and whether investors can trust government to do what they say will do. But there are bigger issues that are confronting PIA. Issues around security of investment in the Delta, the crude theft and vandalization. I mean, those are bigger issues that are, making it difficult for investors to bring money to the country. And of course, the whole conversation around energy transition, which is still very fluid. Many, investors are still trying to get their heads around, what will be the future of investment in fossil fuels. So they've been very cautious, in investing in Nigeria. And of course, everybody knows that gas will be a transition, fuel for a long time to come. But even at that, the framework within which you'll be able to get, funding for gas projects also just in the air and being debated across the world. So I think the issue of fuel subsidy would have impact, but it's not going to be the major driver on the success or otherwise of the Petroleum Industry Act.
Okay, if we take a look at how fuel subsidy may be hurting investments really into the country, we know that the rest of the world moving into greener fuels, a transition. How much do you think that we can gain, especially from crude? Bearing in mind that we have, I think, just about over 37 billion barrels in reserves, if I'm not mistaken, though we have more gas than fuel. But how much do you think that we can gain from crude oil before the rest of the world transitions? Because I think the UK wants to transition, whether in 2030, Norway is transitioning, I think, in 2025. Some other countries are already, we are seeing EVs, electrical vehicles and all of that. So how much time do we still have to still wallow in this we are the 6th producer of oil in the world and be wallowing our, doing shakara with our oil, so to speak?
Okay, so Nancy, just transition is what has been accepted by everyone. That will be a just transition. Of course, that would require that we use gas as transition fuel. Now, there are people who are very optimistic and think that in 10 years we'll phase out, crude oil usage across the world. And there are those who are extremely, unoptimistic, I would say pessimistic about that, that position that, think that, for another 60 years, you still have crude oil in play. I think I believe, in those in the middle ground who think, for the next, 30 years, I think, for up until, maybe 2040, 2050, you still have crude oil as being really very relevant. But what would happen is, regardless of when crude oil goes out of fashion, as the cost of renewable energies start to drop, because right now the economics of renewable energies are quite challenging compared to the economics of fossil. So it's less profitable right now. But as technologies evolve over time, what you will see is that it will increasingly become more profitable renewable energy. I see maybe around 2028 to 2030, you see that handshake at that point in time where project economics of renewable energy would provide the same economic return with that of fossil. I see that at least by 2030. What happens once you get to that point? Because of the growing campaigners and the other NGO and the other pro-health groups, investment in crude oil will dwindle. And what would then mean is that investors will not be willing to fund, projects and also banks. So for Nigeria, we have the opportunity to do something meaningful in the next 10 years. To be honest, after the 10 years, we can't guarantee that, crude oil will be relevant. And to make matters worse, we are classified as a high cost producer. Okay, what typically will cost $2 elsewhere in the oil industry will cost like 4 in Nigeria. So each makes the oil we have in the ground more expensive to produce than elsewhere in the Middle East, for example, even in Angola. And that is why we must put in a lot of energy efficiency resources into even the exploration and production process in Nigeria. Because what would happen is, people will want to put their money where they get the most return, even when they need to, even if it's just 1 barrel they're interested in investing in. If it continues to be expensive as it is in Nigeria, owing to insurance issues, owing to, debt of infrastructure, so owing to insecurity issues, then what you're going to see is, companies they're going to rank their investments, and you see them, if they must invest in Africa, they probably want to go towards East Africa, the Rift, to invest in the gas there, or they want to go towards Angola. If we do not do something to address our cost base, and if you look at our cost base, there are issues around the contracting process, which is unfairly long in Nigeria, and the hurdles to pass through before a contract, gets completed in Nigeria. Issues around, insecurity that I mentioned earlier, crude theft. Nobody wants to invest and be producing $100 barrels, and 90 of those 100 barrels being stolen. So all this, the investors are looking in a basket and are saying, look, is this where I want to put my money? Because right now, even renewables are competing for the same capital that ordinarily would have gone to fossil, production. So that is where we are as Nigerians. We must recognize that fact that if we do not actively reduce the cost of operating in our upstream sector, we will not attract investments. That is just as simple as that. And that's why we must address all those issues. Number one. Number two, increasingly, lenders and investors want to assure their own principals. They are lending responsibly. And what does that mean? Even when you talk about investing in natural gas, there is also still a limit of GHG measurements per kg that they are interested in. So it's not just like, oh, we still have gas as transition fossil, let's just pull money. No, there is still limits of, okay, how much of scope 1 and scope 2 emissions will come with the operations of this exploration work you want to do. Scope 1 and scope 2 essentially relates to the footprint, the carbon footprint of exploration and production process itself. And the world is moving towards the point where people will even be looking at the end-to-end, they will be including scope 3. Scope 3 measures what the end product is used for. So all this will matter, cost of producing Nigeria, and then 2, the GHG footprint in Nigeria. That is why, for example, in our well health, we need to start to think ahead to say, look, maybe we need to electrify even some of the things we do at the upstream. We're using electricity for them. By using electricity for them, we are reducing the GHG footprint. So that's a lot of work, and I know that the commission, the Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Commission, they know the work that is cut out for them. They know what they need to do to maintain that investment, and they need to work with NNPC to make Nigeria optimize the resources we have below ground.
Now, a key thing in this equation, this fuel subsidy and all of that, is to get our refineries to work. How important do you think that this has become? Bearing in mind that we got a lot of news around refineries last year, precisely the Port Harcourt refinery, the GMD of NNPC Limited said a few days ago that the Port Harcourt refinery will be completed by March 2023. We've had several promises, even not from this GMD of NNPC, even from others, even when Kachuku was there, many, the president is even the minister of petroleum. So how integral is getting our refineries to work? I don't want to hear a Dangote refinery yet, because a Dangote refinery is profits driven. And I'm not dissing Dangote refinery, but I'm saying there's so much, we are so much dependent on, oh, let Dangote refine. Once it start working, oh, all our problems will be solved. Is that it also?
Okay, so Nancy, so let me start by going back to the numbers I shared earlier. 450 naira per liter of crude oil is required. About 100 naira refining cost, that is 550 naira. So even if you have all the refineries in Nigeria that can meet our 1.5 billion liters consumption a day, we still have to make a decision about subsidy, because it simply means that even without considering the cost of transportation and the cost of marketing, we already have 550 naira per liter. So if the refineries were working today, will NNPC continue to spend 550 naira a liter to refine and sell to us at 165? I suppose those are questions that government needs to answer. So we can have all the refineries in this world, okay? But the question is, we have to deal with the issue of subsidy. I mean, the difference between a refinery in Nigeria and a refinery outside of Nigeria is largely, transportation, really. So if you take transportation away, we're still left with 80% of that cost to deal with, which then borders on subsidy. Now, by the way, I think that if we have our refineries working, it's just a temporary fix, because the world is moving away from combustion engine, and it's just a matter of time. And even for those that still have combustion engine, increasingly people are advocating the use of fuel with less carbon footprint, like auto gas or like compressed natural gas. So, because they are cheaper and they have less, carbon footprint. So they left less GHG emissions. So even if we have all the refineries working, it's just a matter of time, Nigerians would be deciding, I mean, some countries in Europe, for example, in the next 10 years, they would stop in 2030, a number of them will stop manufacturing of fully electric cars in their country. So what that does is it shrinks the pool of vehicles that are combustion engine that are using petrol. So the refinery will provide only short to medium term relief. I think the energy strategy of the country needs to be revisited, to ensure that we have 20, 30 years in mind. Because we are a gas producer anyway, transiting from petrol engine to compressed natural gas or to gas should not be much of a challenge, because we have natural gas in abundance. You mentioned earlier, we have almost like 200 TCF of natural gas. And of course, the conversion kit is, maybe, $500 to $700 a kit to convert from petrol engine to compressed natural gas or auto gas, as the case may be. So the refineries will help, but they're not the solution. If you look at it both from the point of view of, does that eradicate the need for subsidy? No, it doesn't, because, well, we still have to deal with the subsidy between the 500 or 600 naira, the X factory cost if we are refining Nigeria, and the 165 we are paying. And then does it resolve the issue in the long term when people are thinking of, okay, we're moving to to other cleaner sources to fuel our car than petrol?
So finally, where do we now go from here? If the refineries are really not the final destination or the final solution where we can, buy fuel at lower cost and all of that. So where do we now go from here? What should Nigerians do, and what should the government do as we close? Perhaps even the incoming government, because the body language of this government is, no, it will be borrowing to pay subsidies till they leave in May 2023.
Okay, so Nancy, from my view, I think we need to look at the long term and have a strategic view of the long term. We should accelerate access to the resources we have subsurface, produce this oil and gas as much as we can. Government needs to provide enabling environment, including security, including the bottlenecking, the various challenges around contracting, capacities and all of that, so that we can quickly monetize these resources. We then use it to develop our country, to industrialize our country, because the biggest secret is this: empower the people economically. Subsidy will be less of an issue, because if the minimum wage in this country is 200,000 naira a month, if you remove subsidy, maybe someone that's been spending, 20,000 will now be spending, maybe 40,000. The person can still live with it. So we must develop the economy. That is really the secret. And the government, in developing a long-term strategy, must also be mindful. We have, the Gen Zs now and part of the millennials who have a different view about life than, our generation do. Even in Nigeria here, I see people who are more concerned about the environment. They're pro-green. And those generations, if we do not factor them into our strategic planning, will cause us a lot of problems. They are the generation that would come one day and insist that all refineries must be shut down in this country because they don't want anything that is polluting the economy. We've seen that across the world. They're very different. I mean, a friend was sharing with me what happened, with a friend at a grocery store in Germany recently. He went to buy something, and the young chap came into the store, picked, a particular food item, a fruit, and checked where it was produced from, and because it was coming from Latin America, said no, this has too high, carbon footprint. Obviously, because it either had to be shipped by ship or by air into the country, and because of that, refused to buy it. That is the generation we're going to be dealing with 5, 10 years to come. Conscious about the environment, and so when we are planning for the future, remember the future is not ours, it's not for our generation. If you're planning 50, 60 years, you must be planning bearing in mind the attitude and what is important to those people that will be, adults, in those future years. So
Okay.
it's about having a long-term view of what this country needs to look like, and and using that to create short to medium-term goals. We need to get the resources out. We need to enable it, do everything that is possible by government. Then let's sell it, let's realize the money, let's monetize the gas, use it to develop the industrial zones across the country, and generally lift people out of poverty, empower them economically, invest significantly in education, invest significantly in healthcare. If you focus so much on human capital, it may even be the export of the future for this country.
Okay.
Nancy.
Thank you very much, Olumide, for joining us today. Thank you for your insight, and it's been a long one for us today. We've done the interview for about 50 minutes, so thank you for your insights this morning. Thank you very much. Have a lovely day.
Thanks, Nancy. Thanks for having me on your show.
All right, I've been speaking with Olumide Esan, who is a partner, West Africa Energy and Resources Leader. We've been talking about the issue of fuel subsidy. You've heard it there. What more can I say? Be the best you can be and be the change that you want to see. I am Nancy Nnaji. Bye for now.